Florida, 1830. The U.S. government signs the Indian Removal Act, unleashing a relentless campaign to force every native tribe east of the Mississippi off their land. Yet, when federal officials draw their lines and issue their ultimatums, one group refuses to move. In defiance of orders, treaties, and overwhelming military force, the Seminole and their black allies vanish into the wild heart of the Everglades. 7 years, 30,000 soldiers, and $40 million later, the United States gains nothing but losses, and the Seminole never sign a peace treaty, surrender, or accept defeat. How did the only native tribe America could never defeat rewrite the outcome of an entire war, and what buried truths explain their survival? In 1819, the United States secured Florida from Spain with the Adams-Onis Treaty, opening the door to new federal ambitions in the Southeast. By 1830, Congress passed the Indian Removal Act, granting the president sweeping authority to negotiate, or simply enforce, the removal of native peoples from their homelands east of the Mississippi. The law's language was blunt. Tribes must exchange their ancestral lands for territory west of the river or face the consequences. Debates in Washington grew heated, but the act passed, and President Andrew Jackson wasted no time. Removal agents arrived in Florida, armed with deadlines and legal documents. The Treaty of Payne's Landing, signed in 1832 under mounting pressure, set a 3-year clock for the Seminoles to leave. Official records from the National Archives and Library of Congress still preserve the signatures and the fine print. Terms written for compliance, not consent. As the deadline approached, federal officials issued warnings and ultimatums, expecting the Seminoles to follow the path already forced on the Choctaw and Creek. But the reality on the ground was far messier. Councils hesitated, and resistance simmered beneath the surface. The machinery of removal was in motion, but the Seminoles were not ready to vanish quietly. The stage was set for confrontation, and the clock was ticking. Inside the council house at Fort King, the air was thick with tension. Chiefs McCanopy, Jumper, Alligator, and others gathered around the fire, their faces set. U.S. Agent Wiley Thompson read out President Jackson's threat: leave Florida or face the Army. The response was swift and unanimous. The Seminoles would not go. Their words were recorded in Thompson's own hand. They did not feel bound by the treaty, and they had no intention of moving west. But this was not just a Seminole stand. Black Seminoles, descendants of people who had escaped slavery and built their own communities alongside the tribe, were present too. Their leaders, including John Horse, brought news from the swamps and fields, offering intelligence and supplies. In these councils, alliances were not just discussed, they were lived. Black and Seminole families shared food, information, and strategy. U.S. officers watching from the outside noted how this partnership made resistance stronger. When the chiefs sent word to the Army that no one would leave, it was a decision backed by both Seminole and Black Seminole voices. From Big Cypress to Kissimmee, camps buzzed with preparations. Scouts mapped out escape routes, and runners carried messages between villages. The refusal to emigrate was not a single act, but a networked collective stand, a promise that whatever came next, they would face it together. At dawn on December 28, 1835, Major Francis Dade's detachment marched north on the Fort King Road, their boots crunching through the pale sand of Florida's pine flatwoods. The soldiers expected a routine journey, but hidden in the dense undergrowth, Seminole warriors waited in silence. McCanopy, Alligator, and Jumper had chosen their ground carefully, a narrow stretch where longleaf pines and oak hammock pressed close to the road, offering perfect cover. The first volley shattered the quiet, cutting down Dade and nearly half his men in seconds. Musket balls tore through the morning haze, and the survivors scrambled to form a defensive square around a 6-pounder cannon. But the terrain worked against them. Seminole fighters moved swiftly between palmetto and pine, using every dip and rise in the land to close the distance. A second barrage left the column in chaos. By the time the smoke cleared, only a handful of U.S. soldiers remained alive. Archaeological surveys at the site have uncovered musket balls, uniform buttons, and fragments of shattered equipment, silent witnesses to the speed and violence of the attack. Out of 108 men, just 3 survived the day. Seminole accounts claim their own losses were minimal. The Dade ambush sent shockwaves across the country, and the war that followed would become the longest and costliest in U.S. history. The pine flatwoods and wetlands had turned into the Seminoles' greatest ally, shaping every battle that came after. The U.S. Army poured men and money into Florida, but the war ground on with no end in sight. By 1837, the official cost had ballooned to somewhere between $30 and $40 million, an amount that drew angry questions from Congress and headlines in every major newspaper. The military sent more than 10,000 regulars and nearly 30,000 militia and volunteers into the swamps. But the real enemy was often disease. Army surgeon logs from St. Augustine list over 225 sick or wounded at one hospital alone in September 1836. Malaria, dysentery, and fever claimed more lives than Seminole bullets ever did. Hospitals overflowed, and the dead were buried in shallow graves along the edges of the camps. As the fighting dragged on, stories of waste and corruption became hard to ignore. Congressional inquiries uncovered wild spending on supplies. Boats meant for the Everglades sometimes cost the Navy over $200 each, while the Army got them for a fraction of that price. The $226 canoe became a punchline in Washington, even though no official ledger ever confirmed the number. But nobody doubted the war was draining the treasury and patience in equal measure. Meanwhile, the face of resistance changed. In October 1837, Osceola, one of the best-known Seminole leaders, was captured under a white flag of truce outside St. Augustine. His imprisonment outraged both supporters and critics of the war. But Osceola's absence didn't break the Seminole will. Billy Bowlegs, younger and just as determined, took up the fight. His raids on U.S. patrols and supply lines kept the Army guessing, and the swamps remained a fortress. By the early 1840s, the campaign had become a war of attrition, one the government no longer wanted to pay for, and one the Seminoles refused to lose. In August 1842, Colonel William J. Worth announced that the war in Florida was finished. Yet no peace treaty was signed, and no Seminole leader offered a formal surrender. Instead, small bands slipped deeper into the Everglades and Big Cypress, their homes hidden by sawgrass and cypress trees. Federal agents kept lists of those removed, over 3,000 names sent west, but the records always left gaps. Hundreds remained unaccounted for, living quietly in remote camps. These survivors raised children, held councils, and guarded their stories. Decades later, when the government tried to count or relocate them again, they found families who had never left. The Seminole Tribe of Florida would later call themselves the Unconquered, tracing their legal status and identity back to the fact that in the end, no one ever took their land by treaty or by force. Federal recognition came in 1957, but the Seminole story didn't stop there. Over the next decades, tribal leaders charted a new course, one rooted in self-reliance and economic vision. In 2007, the Seminole Tribe of Florida bought Hard Rock International, making headlines as the first Native nation to own a global hospitality brand. Casino revenues now fund everything from healthcare to language programs, while profits are reinvested in the community. But prosperity isn't just about business. The tribe remains a driving force in Everglades restoration, working to protect the same wetlands that once hid their ancestors. Seminole environmental teams help manage water flows, restore native plants, and defend sacred sites from development. Today, the phrase, "the Unconquered," isn't just a memory, it's a living reality, Woven into every decision from the boardroom to the backcountry, the Seminoles have turned survival into sovereignty and resistance into a model for modern success. By 1842, after 7 years and over $30 million spent, the United States declared the Second Seminole War over, without a treaty and without forcing the last Seminoles from their homeland. Military records show more than 10,000 regular troops and 30,000 militia were deployed, yet several hundred Seminoles evaded capture in the Everglades. No formal surrender was ever signed. The fate of families who hid or vanished into the swamps remains partly undocumented, and details of some wartime negotiations are still lost to history. Today, the Seminole Tribe of Florida identifies as the Unconquered, a title grounded in their survival and recognized by federal law since 1957. Their continued stewardship of land and culture, from Everglades restoration to major business enterprises, stands as living proof of endurance. The evidence is clear. The Seminoles resisted removal, maintained their identity, and remain unconquered to this day.